This is the Quality Coaching Roadshow with Anne-Marie Charrett and Margaret Deneen. We chat with people from all over the world to better understand what quality means to them and how to drive a quality mindset. What are you waiting for? Let's get this show on the road. Welcome everyone. Today I've got Beth Skurrie from Bethesque, and she's going to be talking to us today about trade-offs in software development. So welcome, Bethany. It's great to have you on the Quality Coaching Roadshow, and maybe you could spend a little bit of time introducing yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, my name is Beth Skurrie, and I'm currently working on a product/spin-off company called PACT. We're dedicated to making it easier to test the ever-growing number of integration points that we have in our organizations these days. And the product and the company kind of grew organically out of many years of work that my colleagues and I at Bethesque put into a open source contract testing tool called PACT. And I'm sure it will come up as we keep talking in the podcast today.
Okay, cool. Because I think one of the things that I ask a lot of people who come onto the show is the first basic question is, what is quality to you? And in your context, what do you think quality is?
So obviously we're talking about software quality. To me, I think good quality software is software that allows a company to be its best, to reach its fullest potential. And to do that, I think software has to allow a company to respond quickly to a market. It has to be reliable so that the customers and the other companies that deal with them have confidence and trust in them. Ultimately, software is not there for its own sake. It is there to fulfill a need for a company or an organization. So quality is more about, for me, how it is helping the company reach its goals rather than being necessarily about particular metrics. I think the metrics, you use them to help you work out whether you're on track and help you to reach those goals, but the metrics aren't the goals in themselves.
One of the reasons why I've asked you on the show is because I know you come from a developer background. And for me, one of the big things is to have insights from other people who are passionate about quality. And I'm absolutely fixed in this view, maybe even fixated, that people are passionate about quality, but it just means different things to different people.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, from your perspective, what do you think in general developers perceive quality to be? Is it how you've described it, or do you think they see it as something different?
If we're talking code, I think developers would instinctively jump to things like, is it well factored? Is the code, following the paradigms of the languages nicely? Does it have a good level of test coverage? Not too much, not too little, though that in itself is a contentious topic. Code, to me, code that is quality code is code which first does what it needs to do, but then is also easily modified. Okay. So there's no point giving a company the most beautifully optimized software that works for their problem today and yet is unable to be changed without great ease. You can't have a beautiful product today and then put out the next version of it in 12 months time, because the markets just move too quickly these days. Responsiveness is kind of a quality in itself.
Given that fact, can you give us some sort of typical things that might be things to look out for? I'm guessing things like comments in code is one example of being able to quickly understand what's happening in the code. Are there other things?
Well, interesting. I would say if you actually want to write a comment and you feel the need to write a comment, perhaps your code needs to be written in a way that it's more easily understood. So for me, comments are actually a last resort. Not to say I would never comment. Like most often my comments are explaining bizarre business reasons why a particular piece of code is doing something unexpected. But if I feel the need to write a comment, my learnt response now is to go, oh, can I write this code in a more understandable way so that somebody coming in who doesn't even need that comment, they can just look at the code to understand what's going on. And then if that's not adequate, then the tests themselves should be explaining and documenting what the code needs to do so that a comment is not required. But then if a comment is required, you stick the comment in. That's my personal Beth philosophy on comments.
Okay, thank you for that, Beth. Will be forever stuck in my mind.
Yeah. But other aspects of quality, readability is very important for quality. Dry is an interesting concept. The original author of the do not repeat yourself concept, which we hear so much of, wasn't actually talking about necessarily like lines of code repeating themselves. He was talking about business concepts, that you should not be repeating business concepts and rules all through your code base. For example, I don't know, a maximum length or a particular validation rule on a field. You don't want that repeated in 5 different places in your code, because if that business rule changes, as it always will, you're going to have to go and update 5 different places in your code. You want consistent business rule application and consistent understanding of business concepts in your code. But there's a lot of tools these days that supposedly help you achieve quality code, that tell you, oh, you know, there's these 4 lines of code that are very similar to each other. Perhaps you should consider refactoring them. And that can actually lead to unnecessarily coupled code, where you've actually extracted things that are similar between 2 bits of code, 2 areas, but now those 2 pieces of code are coupled so tightly together that if there are going to be changes in use cases for one of those points that uses it, that then impacts a whole heap of other places that it shouldn't necessarily impact. So quality code to me is, yes, you're using tools to give you insights into your code, but your experience and your human knowledge of what that code is doing should always override that tool.
I think that's really interesting to hear. I haven't heard that perspective before, and I guess you're talking about tools like SonarQube and things like that.
Yes.
And that do that. And you know, as someone who's sort of coming from the, I guess, outside and not necessarily a coder myself, they seem like amazing things that you could have, you know, and it's like, yes. And so if I go to somewhere, I go, look, you know, do you realize that there's tools out there that you can use? But I had no idea that it created problems in itself. And I guess that makes total sense, right? Because no tool is ever going to replace a human.
No,
not yet anyway.
The tools, they're very good at identifying things, but you use the tool should not use you. I
mean, we have that a lot in software testing, of course, as well, you know, where we, you know, you have such amazing tools in software testing that we can use to speed up the testing, and we can have, you know, running tests in parallel, but it never takes, we still haven't found a tool yet to create a really good test, or to discover how to, which we'll come to later, test less, you know.
Yes.
So I hear you on that dilemma, and they're such alluring tools to have, aren't they, to kind of like, this will solve all our problems, and they do partially, I guess, but you know, they also create different types of problems that we don't even anticipate. We wanted to talk about this concept of trade-offs, right? So what do you mean in terms of trade-offs from your perspective? What sort of trade-offs do you have, and do you find yourself encountering on a daily basis?
Well, from a developer perspective, there's been a bit of a history of automated testing, and my experience with testing is primarily as a developer in the automated testing space. So when I started in IT about 15 years ago, unit testing was not brand new, of course, but I'd say still gaining in popularity. And there was a movement that came which basically said, okay, every piece of code that you write should have a unit test. We want 100% code coverage. Now, I think we've got a more mature view on that these days, in that, like, this is a technical developer term, but there's no point testing getters and setters. Like, they're the most fundamental part of a class is setting a value and getting a value. Like, we don't test the trivial stuff anymore, I don't think. The trade-off for getting to our 100% code coverage was we now have a test suite that every time we need to make a change, even a trivial change, we have to update our test suite. And every time we run our tests, we have excess time being allocated to these tests that we don't necessarily need. So where there's the cost in terms of the developer time for writing an automated test, there's the cost in terms of running the test, the feedback cycles get slower. I've worked on many a code base that has tests that are just doing so much and they're so slow, and people are afraid to take them out, and they're slowing the whole process down and not actually contributing greatly to the quality of the code. So I think that the thing about trade-offs that really interests me with automated testing is that we need to consider every time we add a test, is this test long-term valuable? Like, do I really want this test to be run 20 times a day for the next 10, 15 years? The idea of a temporary test is a really interesting concept. I think J.B. Rainsberger talked about it in his talk, Integration Tests Are a Scam, where he's like, when you find a bug, write your integration test to find the bug, and then you'll find somewhere down in the code, write down somewhere, there'll be one line where the problem is. Now write the unit test for that little one line, and then get rid of your temporary end-to-end test. That means your test suite, you're still keeping it fast and giving quick feedback without burdening yourself every time there's a small regression with this massive end-to-end test suite.
I have too thought about this concept of throwaway tests, and every test has an end by date. A bit like eggs, like got to check to see, what's the end by date of this test. Yeah. Is it passed? And a lot of the time I find, in regression, a lot of these big, massive regression test suites, I've been in places they take 5 days to run. What about TDD then? Because I think some of the things that I understand with test-driven development, and I spent a couple of years working with devs in that context, one of the things that when we talked about testing, I realized that the purpose of a test in TDD is slightly different to maybe that is from a testing, as in a testing perspective. By that I mean you're using a test to build, right, a design.
Yes.
And so like you're building your test first because that's what you want the outcome to be, and then you build your code to that test.
Yep.
And to some degree I wonder if those tests should sometimes be temporary tests too, because the actual level of abstraction that they're being created at might not be at the right place for long-term work. I don't know. That's I don't know. I hadn't just occurred to me.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of those two things together. But yes, often you'll have very fine-grained, granular tests when you're doing TDD. But having said that, those are often the ones that run quickly. And I feel like we're circling around the test pyramid here. Yeah. And that we really have to just jump in and talk about it. So the test pyramid, I've really come to love the test pyramid over the last few years. The original test pyramid uses concepts that we wouldn't necessarily use today. It was broken down into, I think, UI tests,